Dr. Marcus Thompson stared at the holographic display in disbelief, his coffee growing cold in his trembling hands. The assignment details scrolled past his eyes like a death sentence wrapped in bureaucratic language. After 15 years of groundbreaking xenobiology research at the Galactic Conservation Institute, this felt like the ultimate insult. Observation duty on Kepler 442b, he muttered, reading the words that would define the next phase of his career. Monitor the final population of the Zephyrian species. Document their extinction process for historical records. His supervisor, Dr. Amanda Richardson, had delivered the news with the enthusiasm of someone announcing a parking violation. Marcus had built his reputation on saving endangered species across 3-star systems, but apparently, that meant nothing when budget cuts demanded sacrifices. The Zephyrians were already beyond help, she'd explained with cold efficiency. His job was simply to watch them die and write about it. The transport ship Meridian carried Marcus through the void toward what everyone assumed would be his professional exile. As the weeks passed in hyperspace, he reviewed everything known about the Zephyrians. They were once a thriving civilization of crystalline beings, their bodies composed of living mineral structures that could manipulate electromagnetic fields. Their planet had been strip-mined by the Hegemony Corporation 50 years ago, leaving behind a poisoned wasteland where only 12 individuals remained. 12. That number haunted Marcus as he watched the stars streak past his viewport. 12 souls representing the final chapter of a species that had once numbered in the billions. The official reports classified them as terminally declining with no viable conservation pathway. In other words, they were already dead. They just hadn't stopped breathing yet. When the Meridian finally dropped out of hyperspace, Marcus got his first glimpse of Kepler 442b. The planet hung in space like a diseased eye, its surface scarred by massive mining operations that had torn away entire continents. What had once been a world of crystal cities and electromagnetic storms was now a barren rock surrounded by the skeletal remains of orbital processing stations. The research outpost where Marcus would spend the next 2 years was a prefabricated structure dropped on the least contaminated landmass. As he stepped off the transport, the thin atmosphere burned his lungs despite his environmental suit. The gravity was lighter than Earth's, making each step feel like a bounce on a trampoline. In the distance, he could see the shimmer of the Zephyrian settlement, a collection of weakly glowing structures that pulsed like a dying heartbeat. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the outgoing researcher, greeted Marcus with the hollow stare of someone who had spent too long watching death approach. She was supposed to brief him on the Zephyrians' current condition, but her reports told a story of gradual system failure. The remaining 12 individuals were slowly losing their ability to maintain their crystalline structures, their bodies becoming increasingly fragile as the planetary electromagnetic field continued to weaken. "They know they're dying," Elena said as she packed her equipment. "They've accepted it. Your job is to document how they face extinction. The Institute wants to understand the psychological processes of species death for future reference." Marcus watched Elena's transport disappear into the toxic sky, leaving him alone with his mission. The research station felt like a tomb, its sterile corridors echoing with the hum of life support systems. He spent his first week reviewing Alina's notes and setting up his own observation equipment. The Zephyrians lived in a cluster of crystal formations about 2 kilometers from the outpost, their structures gradually dimming as their biological processes slowed. From his monitors, Marcus could observe the aliens' daily routines. They moved with the slow, deliberate grace of beings conserving every ounce of energy. Their forms were beautiful even in decay, like living sculptures of amber and quartz that caught and refracted the pale sunlight. They seemed to spend most of their time in what appeared to be meditation, their bodies pulsing with synchronous patterns that suggested some form of communication. As the days turned into weeks, Marcus found himself drawn to one particular Zephyrian. This individual was slightly larger than the others, with crystalline formations that had taken on a deep blue hue. While the others remained mostly stationary, this one moved around the settlement, tending to the dimming structures with movements that seemed almost desperate. Marcus began calling him Azure in his notes, though he knew the being likely had a name that couldn't be pronounced by human vocal cords. The more Marcus observed, the more he began to question the assumptions in his mission briefing. The Zephyrians weren't simply waiting to die. They were actively maintaining their settlement, repairing damaged structures, and engaging in what appeared to be complex social behaviors. Azure, in particular, seemed to be working on something Marcus couldn't quite understand, moving between different crystal formations and causing them to pulse with increased intensity. Marcus's first real breakthrough came when he decided to approach the settlement directly. The Institute's protocols discouraged direct contact, but Marcus had always believed that true understanding required proximity. He suited up and made the trek across the barren landscape, his boots crunching on the crystallized sand that had once been fertile soil. The Zephyrians noticed his approach immediately. Their bodies brightened, electromagnetic fields crackling around them like nervous energy. Marcus stopped at what he judged to be a respectful distance and activated his universal translator, though he wasn't sure it would work with beings who communicated through electromagnetic pulses rather than sound. To his surprise, Azure separated from the group and moved toward him. The being's crystalline form towered over Marcus, easily 3 meters tall, with faceted surfaces that reflected the dying light in complex patterns. For a long moment, they simply regarded each other across the void of species and understanding. Then Azure spoke, not through sound, but through direct electromagnetic transmission that Marcus's suit picked up and translated. The voice that emerged from his speakers was like crystal bells chiming in harmony, beautiful and alien and heartbreaking. "You are the Watcher," Azure said, "the one who records our ending." Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat. The directness of the statement, the resignation in those crystalline tones, hit him like a physical blow. He had come here expecting to observe the final stages of extinction, but he hadn't prepared for the emotional weight of beings who knew they were dying. "I am," Marcus replied, his voice sounding small through the translator. "I'm here to learn about your people to preserve your story." Azure's form pulsed with what Marcus interpreted as amusement. "Our story ends with us. There will be no more chapters written when we are gone." Over the following days, Marcus found himself returning to the settlement again and again. The Zephyrians, initially wary, began to accept his presence. They were dying, yes, but they were also curious about this strange organic being who had come to witness their final days. Azure became his primary contact, patiently explaining Zephyrian culture and history while Marcus documented everything. The story that emerged was one of incredible tragedy and resilience. The Zephyrians had been a peaceful species, their entire civilization built around the harmonious manipulation of electromagnetic fields. They had been artists and philosophers, their crystal cities works of art that could be seen from orbit. The Hegemony Corporation had arrived with promises of trade and mutual benefit, but those promises had been lies designed to facilitate the systematic destruction of the planet's crystal core. "We felt the world dying beneath us," Azure explained during one of their conversations. "Our connection to the planetary field weakened each day as they extracted more crystal. We tried to adapt, to find new ways to maintain our life forces, but there was not enough time to evolve." Marcus learned that the Zephyrians were not merely dying of old age or disease. Their bodies were failing because the electromagnetic environment they needed to survive was being systematically destroyed. It was like watching fish die as their ocean was drained, drop by drop, until only puddles remained. The more Marcus understood about the Zephyrian situation, the more he realized that the Institute's mission was fundamentally flawed. These beings weren't experiencing natural extinction. They were the victims of environmental destruction on a planetary scale, and everyone had simply accepted their death as inevitable because saving them would be too expensive and complex. As his second month on the planet began, Marcus noticed changes in the Zephyrian settlement. The structures were dimming more rapidly, and several of the beings had stopped moving entirely. Azure's blue glow was fading to a pale silver, and the electromagnetic fields around the settlement were becoming increasingly erratic. "How long do you have?" Marcus asked during one of their daily conversations. "The calculations suggest perhaps 2 of your months," Azure replied. "The youngest among us might last longer, but without the ability to reproduce, the ending is certain." Marcus felt something crack inside his chest. 2 months. 2 months to watch 12 intelligent beings fade away because their world had been murdered for profit. The injustice of it consumed him, burning through his professional detachment like acid. That night, Marcus sat in his research station, staring at the reports he was supposed to be filing. The Institute wanted detailed observations of the Zephyrians' declining biological processes, psychological analyses of how they faced extinction, and recommendations for future species death studies. The paperwork felt obscene, like writing a restaurant review while watching someone starve to death. Marcus had always followed protocols, always trusted the system that had trained him and given him purpose. But the system had failed the Zephyrians completely. The Hegemony Corporation had destroyed their world with legal impunity, and now the Institute was treating their extinction as a research opportunity rather than a tragedy that demanded action. He pulled up the environmental data from the planet's mining operations, cross-referencing it with his observations of Zephyrian biology. The answer was there: buried in the technical specifications and electromagnetic readings. The planet's core still contained enough residual crystal to support Zephyrian life, but it was dispersed and difficult to access. The mining operations had been stopped not because the resources were depleted, but because the remaining deposits were too small to be profitable. Marcus spent the next week running calculations and modeling scenarios. The Zephyrians needed a stable electromagnetic environment to survive, but they were too weakened to access the planet's remaining resources. However, if someone could help them establish a connection to the deeper crystal formations, if the right technology could be brought to bear, there might be a chance. The problem was that saving the Zephyrians would require resources, approval, and most importantly, the will to act. The Institute had already written them off as a lost cause, and the Hegemony Corporation certainly wouldn't fund conservation efforts on a world they had already strip-mined. Marcus was just one xenobiologist with a tiny research budget and no political influence. But he had something else. He had 15 years of experience, a reputation for innovative conservation techniques, and most importantly, he had met the Zephyrians face to face. He knew them as individuals, not just as specimens in a research study. The thought of watching Azure and the others fade away while he wrote reports about their death process filled him with a rage that surprised him with its intensity. Marcus had always been the quiet, methodical type. He followed procedures, respected authority, and trusted that the system would eventually do the right thing. But the system had failed the Zephyrians so completely that it had become complicit in their extinction. If he wanted to save them, he would have to act outside the system, and that meant taking risks that could destroy his career and possibly land him in prison. The decision, when it came, felt inevitable. Marcus couldn't watch 12 intelligent beings die because no one was willing to take a chance on saving them. He couldn't write reports about their extinction while knowing that alternatives existed. He couldn't be complicit in their death when he had the knowledge and skills to at least try to help them. The next morning, Marcus walked to the Zephyrian settlement with a proposal that would change everything. Azure greeted him with the same patient dignity that had characterized all their interactions, but Marcus could see that the being was weaker, his crystalline form flickering like a candle in the wind. "I have an idea," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was proposing. "It's dangerous and it might not work, but I think there's a way to save your people." Azure's form pulsed with something that might have been hope. "We have listened to promises before, Dr. Thompson. They led to the destruction of our world." "This isn't a promise," Marcus replied. "It's a plan, and I'm going to need your help to make it work." Dr. Marcus Thompson had spent his career working within the system, trusting that proper channels and established procedures would eventually lead to positive outcomes. But as he stood in the dying light of Kepler 442b, facing a being whose entire species had been abandoned by that same system, he realized that sometimes the only way to serve science was to rebel against it. The plan forming in his mind was ambitious, risky, and possibly illegal. It would require him to violate his research protocols, exceed his authority, and potentially destroy his career. But as he looked at Azure's fading form and thought about the 11 other Zephyrians slowly dying in their crystal settlement, Marcus knew that some things were more important than following orders. He was about to discover that saving a species would require more than scientific knowledge and good intentions. It would require him to become something he had never been before, a rebel with a cause worth fighting for, even if it meant standing alone against the entire galactic scientific establishment. The real battle for the Zephyrian survival was just beginning, and Marcus was about to learn that sometimes the greatest discoveries come not from following the rules, but from having the courage to break them when breaking them is the only way to do what's right. Marcus spent the next 3 days locked in his research station, working on calculations that officially didn't exist. He had convinced Azure to provide detailed information about Zephyrian biology and their relationship with electromagnetic fields, data that went far beyond what the Institute's previous studies had gathered. The Zephyrians, it turned out, had been carefully managing their revelation of their own capabilities, sharing only what they felt was safe with the humans who had come to study them. The truth was far more complex and hopeful than anyone had realized. The Zephyrians weren't simply dying from environmental degradation. They were slowly losing their connection to the planetary electromagnetic matrix that had sustained their species for millions of years. The mining operations had disrupted this matrix, but they hadn't destroyed it entirely. Deep beneath the planet's surface, in the untouched crystal formations that had been too difficult for the Hegemony Corporation to extract, the electromagnetic field still pulsed with life. "We can feel it," Azure had explained during their clandestine meeting. "The heart of our world still beats, but we are too weak to reach it. The connection requires more energy than our failing bodies can provide." Marcus had found the solution in his own research equipment. The massive electromagnetic generators that powered his research station were designed to create controlled field environments for his experiments. With some modification, those same generators could be used to amplify the Zephyrians' natural abilities, giving them the power boost they needed to reconnect with their planet's deep electromagnetic matrix. The problem was that such modifications would be impossible to hide from the Institute's monitoring systems. Every piece of equipment Marcus used was tracked and recorded, every power fluctuation logged and analyzed. The moment he began modifying his generators, alarms would sound at the Institute headquarters, and his career would be over. But Marcus had spent 15 years working within the system, and he knew its weaknesses as well as its strengths. The Institute's monitoring systems were designed to detect unauthorized experiments and resource theft, not conservation efforts. If he could frame his modifications as legitimate research, he might be able to complete his work before anyone realized what he was actually doing. Marcus began by filing a series of research proposals with the Institute's review board. He claimed to be investigating the theoretical possibility of electromagnetic field manipulation as a conservation technique, using the Zephyrians as a test case for future application to other endangered species. The proposals were dense with technical language and theoretical frameworks, exactly the kind of academic exercise that the Institute loved to fund. While waiting for approval, Marcus began making subtle modifications to his equipment. He worked during the planet's brief nights, when the Institute's monitoring systems were focused on other research stations across the galaxy. Each modification was small and seemingly innocuous, but together they would transform his research station into a powerful electromagnetic amplification system. The approval for his theoretical research came through faster than expected, along with a modest budget increase and encouragement to publish his findings in the Institute's prestigious journal. Marcus almost laughed at the irony. The Institute was funding its own violation of protocol, paying him to save a species they had already written off as extinct. As Marcus worked on his modifications, he continued his daily visits to the Zephyrian settlement. The aliens were clearly deteriorating, their movements becoming slower and their electromagnetic fields weaker. 2 of the 12 had stopped moving entirely, entering what Azure described as a hibernation state that might preserve their lives for a few more weeks. "Time is running short," Azure admitted during one of their conversations. "If your plan is to work, it must be soon." Marcus nodded, understanding the urgency. His modifications were nearly complete, but he needed to run several tests before attempting to connect the Zephyrians to the planet's deep electromagnetic matrix. A failure could drain what little energy the aliens had left, killing them instantly instead of saving them. The testing phase proved to be the most dangerous part of the operation. Marcus had to run his modified generators at increasingly high power levels, creating electromagnetic pulses that could be detected by monitoring stations across the star system. He disguised these tests as calibration procedures, filing false reports that claimed he was having technical difficulties with his equipment. The deception worked for nearly a week. Marcus successfully tested his modifications and confirmed that his generators could produce the kind of electromagnetic field necessary to amplify Zephyrian abilities. He was preparing for the final phase of his plan when his secure communication terminal chimed with an incoming message from Dr. Amanda Richardson. "Dr. Thompson," her voice carried the cold authority that Marcus had learned to dread. "We've been monitoring some unusual electromagnetic activity from your station. Please explain the nature of your current research activities." Marcus felt his stomach drop, but he maintained his composure. "I'm conducting the theoretical research approved in Proposal GCI 7742, testing electromagnetic field manipulation as a potential conservation technique. Your power consumption has exceeded authorized levels by 300%, Richardson continued. "And our sensors are detecting field signatures that don't match any approved research protocols. I'm scheduling a review board meeting for tomorrow. Be prepared to justify your activities." The communication ended, leaving Marcus staring at his reflection in the blank screen. He had less than 24 hours before the Institute discovered his actual plan. Once they realized what he was attempting, they would shut down his research station and probably have him arrested for violating galactic conservation protocols. Marcus walked to the Zephyrian settlement that evening with a heavy heart. The aliens sensed his distress immediately, their forms flickering with patterns that he had learned to interpret as concern. Azure approached him with the same patient dignity that characterized all their interactions, but Marcus could see that the being was even weaker than before. "The Watchers have discovered your plan," Azure said, somehow understanding the situation without explanation. "Tomorrow," Marcus replied. "If we're going to try this, it has to be tomorrow before they shut down my equipment." Azure's form pulsed with what might have been determination. "Then we will be ready. But Dr. Thompson, you must understand that if this fails, if your attempt to save us is discovered, the consequences for you will be severe." Marcus looked around at the dying settlement, at the 11 other Zephyrians who had become more than research subjects over the past weeks. They were individuals, each with their own personality and perspective, each representing millions of years of evolution and countless generations of culture and achievement. "Some things are worth the consequences," Marcus said simply. The next morning, Marcus made his final preparations. He had less than 12 hours before the Institute's review board meeting, which meant he had to attempt the connection procedure immediately. The risks were enormous. If his calculations were wrong, he could kill the Zephyrians instantly. If his modifications failed, he could overload his generators and destroy his research station. If he succeeded but was discovered, he could face criminal charges that would end his career and possibly land him in prison. Marcus activated his modified generators and began the power-up sequence. The electromagnetic field around his research station intensified, crackling with energy that made his teeth ache and his vision blur. Through his monitors, he could see the Zephyrian settlement beginning to respond, their crystalline forms brightening as they felt the approaching energy. Azure and the other Zephyrians arranged themselves in a complex pattern around their settlement, their bodies beginning to resonate with the electromagnetic field Marcus was projecting. The connection was forming, but it was fragile and unstable. Marcus had to maintain precise control over his generators, while the Zephyrians attempted to establish their link to the planet's deep electromagnetic matrix. For 20 minutes, Marcus balanced on the edge of disaster. His generators screamed with overload warnings, his power systems fluctuated wildly, and his research station shook with the force of the electromagnetic fields he was generating. Through it all, he watched the Zephyrians' desperate attempt to reconnect with their dying world. Then, suddenly, something changed. The chaotic electromagnetic activity around the settlement began to stabilize, forming into coherent patterns that pulsed with increasing strength. The Zephyrians' bodies brightened, their movements becoming more fluid and energetic. Azure's form, which had been fading to silver, began to return to its original deep blue. Marcus realized with growing amazement that it was working. The Zephyrians were successfully connecting to the planet's deep electromagnetic matrix, drawing power from the untouched crystal formations far beneath the surface. His amplification system had given them the energy boost they needed to bridge the gap between their weakened state and the planet's surviving electromagnetic field. But the success came with a price. Marcus's generators were operating far beyond their design limits, and his power systems were beginning to fail. Alarms screamed throughout his research station as system after system went into emergency shutdown. He had perhaps minutes before his equipment would be completely destroyed. Marcus made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Instead of shutting down his generators to preserve his equipment, he pushed them even harder, pouring every ounce of available power into the amplification system. The Zephyrians needed time to establish a stable connection to their planet's electromagnetic matrix, and Marcus was going to give them that time, even if it meant destroying his research station in the process. The explosion, when it came, was visible from orbit. Marcus's research station disappeared in a brilliant flash of electromagnetic energy that temporarily disrupted communications throughout the star system. When the energy dissipated, nothing remained of the station but a crater of fused sand and twisted metal. But in the distance, the Zephyrian settlement blazed with renewed life. The 12 beings who had been slowly dying were now drawing power directly from their planet's core, their bodies strong and energetic for the first time in decades. They had not only survived but were beginning to thrive, their electromagnetic fields growing stronger with each passing hour. Marcus Thompson, meanwhile, was nowhere to be found. The Institute's investigation into the destruction of Research Station Kepler 442b took 3 months to complete. Dr. Amanda Richardson personally led the inquiry, trying to determine how a routine observation mission had resulted in the complete destruction of a multi-million credit facility and the apparent death of one of the Institute's most experienced researchers. The official report concluded that Dr. Thompson had exceeded his authority in attempting an unauthorized conservation experiment, resulting in a catastrophic equipment failure that destroyed his research station and killed him instantly. The report recommended stricter oversight of field researchers and additional safety protocols for future missions. What the report didn't mention was the miraculous recovery of the Zephyrian population. Within weeks of the incident, the 12 surviving aliens had begun to reproduce, their renewed connection to the planetary electromagnetic matrix allowing them to create new offspring for the first time in decades. The species that had been declared extinct was not only surviving, but beginning to rebuild their civilization. The Hegemony Corporation, predictably, filed legal challenges to the Zephyrians' recovery, claiming that their mining rights superseded any conservation efforts. But the galactic courts ruled that the Zephyrians were now strong enough to defend their world, and their electromagnetic abilities made any further mining operations impossible. Dr. Amanda Richardson found herself facing uncomfortable questions from the Institute's board of directors. How had a simple observation mission resulted in the salvation of a species that had been written off as extinct? Why had the Institute's monitoring systems failed to detect Dr. Thompson's activities until it was too late? And most importantly, what did this incident say about the Institute's approach to conservation science? The questions became even more uncomfortable when independent researchers began to study the Zephyrians' recovery. Dr. Thompson's theoretical research, the papers he had filed just before his death, provided a complete framework for electromagnetic field manipulation as a conservation technique. His work was brilliant, groundbreaking, and completely outside the established protocols of the Institute. Within a year, the Thompson method had become the standard approach for saving electromagnetically dependent species throughout the galaxy. The Institute, despite its official condemnation of Thompson's actions, found itself at the forefront of a conservation revolution that saved dozens of species that had previously been considered beyond help. Dr. Amanda Richardson was eventually forced to resign from her position as head of the Institute's Conservation Division. The board cited her failure to recognize the potential of Thompson's research and her inability to provide adequate oversight of field operations. She was replaced by a younger researcher who had studied Thompson's work extensively and was committed to implementing his revolutionary techniques. The Zephyrians, meanwhile, began to share their story with the galaxy. They spoke of the human scientist who had sacrificed everything to save their species, who had risked his career and his life to give them a chance at survival. They built a memorial to Dr. Marcus Thompson at the site where his research station had once stood, a crystal formation that pulsed with electromagnetic energy and could be seen from orbit. Azure, now the leader of the renewed Zephyrian civilization, often spoke to visiting researchers about the human who had saved their species. He would describe Thompson's dedication, his willingness to risk everything for beings he had known for only a few months, and his refusal to accept that extinction was inevitable. He taught us that sometimes the greatest discoveries come not from following the rules, but from having the courage to break them when breaking them is the only way to do what's right, Azure would say. Dr. Thompson showed us that one person with the determination to act can change the fate of an entire species. The memorial to Dr. Marcus Thompson became a pilgrimage site for conservation scientists throughout the galaxy. Young researchers would travel to Kepler 442b to study the Zephyrians' recovery and to learn about the man who had saved them. They would stand before the Poulsing crystal formation and pledge to follow Thompson's example, to never accept that extinction was inevitable, and to always fight for the preservation of life. But the most remarkable part of the story was still to come. 3 years after the destruction of Research Station Kepler 442b, a cargo ship arrived at the planet carrying supplies for the growing Zephyrian population. Among the ship's passengers was a man who looked remarkably like Dr. Marcus Thompson, though he carried identification papers for someone named Dr. Michael Torres, a freelance conservation consultant. The man claimed to be a researcher interested in studying the Zephyrians' recovery, but Azure recognized him immediately. The electromagnetic signature of his thoughts, the pattern of his neural activity, was unmistakable. Dr. Marcus Thompson had somehow survived the destruction of his research station and had been living in exile, waiting for the investigation to conclude and the attention to die down. The reunion between Thompson and the Zephyrians was emotional and private. Azure never revealed the details of their conversation, but afterward, the being would often speak of the human scientist who had not only saved their species, but had given up his own identity to do so. Dr. Marcus Thompson, now living as Michael Torres, continued his conservation work throughout the galaxy. He could never return to the Institute or reclaim his former life, but he could continue to save endangered species using the techniques he had developed. His work became legendary in conservation circles, though few people knew that the mysterious Dr. Torres was actually the man who had saved the Zephyrians. The Zephyrian population continued to grow and thrive. Within a decade, they had rebuilt their civilization and were once again creating the crystal cities that had once made their world famous throughout the galaxy. They became advocates for conservation science, sharing their story with other endangered species and supporting research into electromagnetic field manipulation. Dr. Amanda Richardson, meanwhile, found herself working as a minor administrator in the Institute's archives, filing reports about conservation successes that she had once dismissed as impossible. She often thought about Marcus Thompson and wondered if she had been wrong about more than just the Zephyrians' chances of survival. The story of the Zephyrians' salvation became a legend in conservation science, a tale of one man's refusal to accept the inevitable and his willingness to sacrifice everything for the preservation of life. It was taught in universities, referenced in research papers, and retold around campfires on distant worlds. But for those who knew the truth, the real story was even more remarkable. Dr. Marcus Thompson had not only saved an entire species from extinction, but had proven that sometimes the greatest act of rebellion is simply refusing to let someone die when you have the power to save them. The Zephyrians would never forget the human who had given them a second chance at life. And somewhere in the galaxy, a man named Michael Torres continued his work, saving species and changing lives, carrying on the legacy of the scientist who had dared to break the rules when breaking them was the only way to do what was right. In the end, the story of Dr. Marcus Thompson and the Zephyrians became more than just a tale of conservation success. It became a reminder that the greatest discoveries often come not from following established procedures, but from having the courage to act when action is needed, regardless of the personal cost. The Crystal Memorial on Kepler 442b continued to pulse with electromagnetic energy, a beacon of hope for endangered species throughout the galaxy. And in research stations across the stars, young scientists would look up at the alien sky and remember the man who had shown them that sometimes the only way to serve science is to rebel against it, that sometimes the greatest contribution you can make is to risk everything for the preservation of life. Dr. Marcus Thompson had been sent to watch a dying species, but he had become the reason it still breathed. And in doing so, he had changed not just the fate of the Zephyrians, but the entire approach to conservation science throughout the galaxy. The story lived on, inspiring new generations of scientists to push boundaries, question assumptions, and never accept that extinction is inevitable. Because sometimes, all it takes is one person with the determination to act and the courage to break the rules when breaking them is the only way to save a life. Marcus Thompson had learned that lesson on a dying world, and the galaxy was better for it.